Welcome back to Kings of Columbus on the podcast. Doug Lesmerises, Bill Landis, and we're recording this on Wednesday morning, Bill, and on Tuesday, Ryan Day dropped one on us. And it was the idea that Caleb Downs, best freshman in the country last year at Alabama, arguably the best safety in the country last year, the biggest move in the transfer portal this offseason? Is it like Dylan Gabriel, Riley Leonard, like Caleb Downs is bigger, right? That's the biggest.
He was definitely the best player who switched schools, right? You want to talk about like impact because of what other teams might have needed. Maybe there's a conversation there, but without a doubt, the best player in the move.
Okay. All those things. And now Ryan Day says he might play running back. Dumb. We were sending this out. I was like, he's not switching. It's like the phrasing. He's not switching to running back, but you, Bill Landis, as I find my finger and I point at you, you got this. Look at that finger. I have long fingers. Look at that. Like you 3D. Did this. Liu. You asked, hey, running back depth. Quinshon Judkins, Trayvon Henderson, and a bunch of young guys behind it. What are you going to do, Ryan Day? And he said, well, Bill Landis, I'm glad you asked. Did he have that? You know, you guys talked about this with Austin and Berm on Snap Judgments, but we're going to dive in on this because I think there's one thing where Caleb Downs playing on offense potentially matters the most. And it is, does it make him Ohio State's best Heisman candidate if he sprinkles in some offense? And how much of a legitimate Heisman candidate does it make him if this happens? Was Ryan Day just waiting? Did you and Ryan Day have a conversation in the hallway where he's like, hey, man, Bill, you set me up. You ask about the running back depth, and I'll drop this Caleb thing. We'll make the people happy for a month. How did this happen? Did your head explode when he said this?
Yeah, no, we did not. We did not plan it. I can tell you that. We didn't plan it. Yeah, it did a little bit. I do think sometimes coaches are like savvy enough to like try to distract the media with something shiny over here. Not that Ohio State has like a lot to dive into otherwise. Like they're pretty well put together roster. I don't think they have a ton of questions, but I think sometimes when a coach finds himself in that position, he might dangle a piece of red meat out there to distract people. I don't know if that's what Ryan Day was doing. I honestly don't know if he's that calculated when talking with the media. I think he just kind of says things sort of offhand and as a joke sometimes. But like this wasn't a joke. Like these are conversations that Ohio State had with Caleb Downs the first time they recruited him, and then again the second time they recruited him. Caleb Downs is interested in some way having the ball in his hands in addition to playing safety. But when I asked the question about like, hey, how did you guys land on being comfortable with only 4 running backs? I definitely did not expect Caleb Downs' name to be part of the answer.
So on Tuesday, I did ask about Aaron Dunston leaving for Michigan, which might be the one thing that you want to distract. And I think the way I phrased it was, Ryan, obviously losing Aaron Dunston to Michigan, what did she think of Caleb Downs maybe playing running back? And it worked. No, Ryan Day just refused to talk about Aaron Dunston, which was fine. But so I do think this is almost 1,000% a Heisman conversation. I take that back. Let's break it up into 100%. I think it's a 80% Heisman conversation, 20% like keeping a guy happy who wants to do, like, you're glad he came, he could have transferred somewhere else, like whatever. Like you want to do right by your best players. I think this is like super tiny. This is an important way to help Ohio State win more games, right? This is not like they better put Caleb Downs in on 2nd and 7 at the 11-yard line in the Oregon game in the third quarter. Otherwise, what are they going to do? They'll have to play Trayvon Henderson or Quinshon Judkins. Oh, no. It's like, they don't actually need to do this to win, right?
No, that might be like less than 1% of this conversation. Yeah.
Ball be fun is like the top of the list. Hey, ball. Let's just ball, man. You know, there's all these bills in Congress. Let's play Caleb Downs on offense, right? Just make the people happy. Yeah. But now, if he doesn't, aren't we going to ask every post game, why didn't Caleb Downs play offense this game, Ryan? Doug Lesmerises from King to the North, Kings of Columbus. Why didn't Caleb Downs play offense? I know you guys won 81-3. Why didn't Caleb Downs play offense? She said he might. He put it out there.
Yeah, because those are the kind of games where I think it would happen, right? It's not you're up by 40. Let's toss the ball to Caleb Downs on this play.
So we're making this a Heisman conversation. So
Mhm.
what this has led us into is Ohio State's recent Heisman history, Ohio State's best Heisman candidates since Troy Smith won Ohio State's last Heisman in 2006, where Caleb Downs would fit into that list of best Ohio State Heisman candidates of the last 17 years. We're going to talk about derailed Ohio State Heisman candidacy since Troy. We have a bunch of guys who were way up there. I found this great site, stumbled onto this great site that has old sports odds. So I found like preseason Heisman favorites back to like 2008. Couldn't believe it. It's awesome. I'll tell you guys about it later. Like guys who were like in the preseason at this time, because like there's no juice on Caleb Downs right now in the preseason, right? No, I don't even think
I don't think you can bet. Yeah, he's not on any list that I know of. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about defensive players winning the Heisman, which is maybe the most meaningful conversation here because Caleb Downs is still going to be a defensive player.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of seasons did those guys have who finished there have been in the last 26 years since Charles Woodson won the Heisman as a defensive player at Michigan in 1997. Since then, 26 years, 25 defensive players have finished in the top 10. I think it's 7 have finished in the top 5 of the Heisman voting. How did they do it? What did their seasons look like? How much offense or special teams? How much did those guys have the ball in their hands? Is that a requirement for part of this? Because how would you characterize how much Caleb Downs's Heisman chances would increase if he touches the ball on offense 20 times in the regular season and maybe scores 3 or 4 offensive touchdowns? Does that slightly increase his Heisman chances? Does it turbo boost the Heisman chances? How would you characterize it?
I think it would turbo boost them. Yeah. I think if maybe we were having this conversation 4 months ago, like when Caleb Downs first got here, Caleb Downs would actually be a guy you could bet on to win the Heisman right now. He's not, as far as I know, he's not really anywhere else unless you want to do it offshore and get odds on him to do that. But like I was looking at DraftKings earlier, I didn't see his name on there, but I think his name would be on there if we thought like there's a slight chance that he could play offense. So I think it would increase his odds, his chances of winning, I think significantly.
It's just one of those things where you break in with the highlight and it's Ohio State safety, Caleb Downs, he's on offense, and they ran a reverse. Caleb Downs with a 71-yard touchdown run against Marshall, and the Buckeyes are up 42.
Mm-hmm.
That matters?
That matters. Yeah, that definitely matters.
Yeah. Okay. So this is going to lead us into a kind of a wide-ranging, what I think is a very interesting discussion about Ohio State and Heisman candidates. And this is the stat that blew my mind the most in doing like a day's research on Ohio State Heisman stuff. And I sent it out to our tech subscribers. If you want to be a tech subscriber, man, we're getting it's like right around the corner. 614-662-4509. You can send a text to that number. You get a link back to sign up. You can try it for 2 weeks free. You get surveys, news, insight, recruiting stuff, all kinds of little tidbits right in your phone. And then it's like, what is it? It's like $6 a month, I think, after that.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if you're interested, but I sent this out to the people. First Heisman was handed out in 1935. We are on the precipice of Ohio State being in its longest Heisman drought ever, which is crazy because this is one of those things. This is like when people do it all the time when you go like, hey, the 1970s were as close to the Civil War as they are to now. Right? Yeah. Is that right? And then you're like, what? The Civil War? I didn't live during the Civil War, and time warps and your brain explodes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of those that happened to me. The longest Ohio State Heisman drought is 19 Heisman trophies awarded between Archie Griffin's second Heisman in 1975 and Eddie George's Heisman in 1995. Mm-hmm. 19 Heismans awarded in between. There were 18 Heismans awarded between Hop Cassidy's Heisman in 1955 and Archie Griffin's first Heisman in 1974. So those are currently the two longest droughts. Okay. 19 years and 18 years. But we are currently at 17 years of no Ohio State Heisman since Troy Smith won in 2006. So if Ohio State does not have a Heisman winner this season, in 2025 or in 2026, it will be Ohio State's longest Heisman drought ever. Does that blow your mind?
It mostly blows my mind that 2006 is 17 years ago, because that's the year I graduated high school, and it makes me feel incredibly old.
That's why I did this.
Yeah, but no, that does blow my mind. It's also, I think it does speak highly of Ohio State that we even have the conversation, right? Because there are plenty of schools who have never won a Heisman Trophy, and we're like, can you believe it's been 17 years since Ohio State won its last one? Like, it's almost expected. But no, that is, it's crazy only because like they always have a guy in the mix. Like it's surprising that one has not broken through in 17 years when they've had pretty regular top 5 finishers.
So just a quick rundown here. The first Heisman in 1935. They award 9. Les Horvath wins in 1944. They award 5 more. Vic Janowitz wins in 1950. They award 4 more. Hop Cassidy wins in 1955. Give out 18 more. Archie 1, then Archie 2. 19 years. Eddie George in 1995. 10 years. Hand out 10 Heismans. Then Troy Smith in 06. Now there've been 17 Heismans. And our great producer Mike Yarostowski jumps in, Bill, with on Bet 365. Caleb Downs is plus 150 to win the Heisman. Is that right?
Plus 150.
It's not plus. No, it's 150 to 1. It's 15,000 plus 15,000.
150
right?
to 1. Yeah.
150 to 1. So if you want to go on Bet 365 and little sprinkle on there, you could do that. So yeah, that Hop Cassidy is to Archie Griffin as Troy Smith is to Julian Sand in 2026. But anyway, that's not the show we're doing right now. So Ohio State might be due. Like Ohio State's kind of due for a Heisman. Is that like a weird thing to say?
No, that doesn't. Okay? That it definitely feels that way. Yeah.
Okay.
I think yeah.
Because the 17 Heismans awarded since Ohio State last had a Heisman winner in 2006, we have 4 to Alabama. We have 3 to Oklahoma. We have 2 to LSU, Joe Burrow, former Buckeye, and then Jaden Daniels last year. Then we have 8 schools with 1 each: Florida, Auburn, Baylor, Texas A&M, Florida State, Oregon, Louisville, and USC. By current conference, Bill, that is 12 current SEC Heismans, 2 Big Ten, Oregon and USC, Marcus Mariota and Caleb Williams, 2 ACC, and 1 Big 12. So this has been another situation where the rise of the SEC, the dominance of the SEC, which actually begins, the true era of SEC dominance begins with Florida beating reigning Heisman Trophy winner Troy Smith in 2006. And the SEC takes over the sport. That applies to the Heisman, just like it applies to national titles and the way it applies to the NFL draft and the way it applies to everything. So if we believe, which we do, especially on Kings of the North, our other show, that if you're watching this and listening to this and you've never tried Kings of the North, we would invite you to subscribe to that in another feed. If we think the North is back, I think it means the North is back in the Heisman race as well. I think that's not, it's all connected.
It is all connected. It felt like Michigan winning the national championship, and then I think last year, I voted Michael Penix to win the Heisman last year. I think a lot of people did, right?
I did as well.
Vote. Yeah, that wasn't a win for the North, but that was probably about as close as it's been in a few years. So that felt to me like a nudge back in that direction. Obviously, not all the way there.
Yeah. The SEC takes care of its own. The SEC, I think, often manages to coalesce around a candidate and maybe put aside rivalries, put aside geographical jealousies, and say, let's make sure we vote for this Southern guy. Whereas I think in the North, because the North in college football does not view itself as a single entity, does not view itself culturally connected in the same way that the South does. And someone's going to do something about that. The North didn't coalesce around Michael Penix, I think, in the same way. It's like, well, I think it's Bo Nix, or I think it's JJ McCarthy, or whatever. Like, whereas like everybody from Kentucky on down, if you're wearing a tank top in November, you voted for Jaden Daniels. You just decided that, right? Didn't they all do that?
Without looking through the voting data, I'm assuming that they all did that. Yes, which tends to happen quite a bit. Yeah.
Without looking through the tank top data, yes,
that's right.
We will say that was a true fact. So that's part of this. Like if you've got a guy, then like who's your guy? Now, will the South? You know that Caleb Downs, he was one of us.
He is from Georgia.
He's from Georgia, went to Bama. Ohio State was lucky to get him. Is he one of their guys that if it's there for the taking, the South will rally around Caleb Downs? Or is he a traitor? Is he traitor to the Southern cause? And he's like, he went to Ohio State. He's dead to us. We're all voting for Carson Beck.
Huh. I want to go back and look through the voting to see what the Southern votes were like for Bo Nix.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we'll do this. Well, this is a King of the North. Kings of the North conversation now. Caleb, Doug Lesmerises from Kings of the North. Do you think the South views you as a homegrown native son or a traitor?
I would bet there was a boost.
August.
I bet there was a boost. Yeah.
Bo Nix, Southern boost?
Yeah, I think so.
So the last 17 years of no Ohio State Heisman winner, how many of those 17 years do you think Ohio State had somebody finish in the top 10? How many of those years did they not have anybody finish in the top 10?
I would say they've had somebody in the top 10, 11 of those years.
10.
Okay.
10 of those years, somebody in the top 10, 7 years not. And like the not was all right away. So Troy wins in 06, none in 07, none in 08, none in 09, none in 10, none in 11, which means that they have had, like since then, basically like almost every year.
Yeah.
I think every year, like they've had 10 of 12 years since then. From 2012 on, they've had somebody in the top 10. So overall, they have had 12 top 10 finishers since Ohio State had its last Heisman winner. 3 guys finished 3rd, 3 finished 4th, 2 finished 5th, and then 1 each at 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th. Nobody has finished 2nd. Nobody's finished 10th. That run down very quickly, and we're going to get into some of this more later on, where at the end of the show, we're going to rank like Ohio State's 10 best Heisman candidates since Troy Smith. Because the thing, like before we get into this, Bill, there's so much that goes into a Heisman candidacy, but one is who else is in the mix in your year? Who else on your team is a Heisman candidate and confusing voters? Does your team win the game it needs to win to give you a real chance to do it? Like there's a lot of these things that it's not just how good you are, which again, which is why I like the Heisman, that it's a bunch of stuff squeezed into one and you know exactly what it means. But we're going to rank the top 10 at the end. But like, and the point is to see where Caleb Downs could fit into that mix. Because is this a true statement? Caleb Downs could not be Ohio State's best Heisman candidate since Troy Smith, and he still could win the 2024 Heisman Trophy.
Yeah, because it's the landscape going into this season feels fairly wide open. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll talk about that landscape more a little bit. Let's run through these guys. Okay. Braxton Miller finished 5th in 2012. Braxton Miller finished 9th in 2013. JT Barrett finished 5th in 2014. Ezekiel Elliott finished 8th in 2015. And you can just feel all the almost if this happens kind of stuff within that mix right there. With the way the 15 season went, with what happened with Braxton's injury, there's a couple of things that we're gonna talk about derailed candidacies a little bit later on, and I have some thoughts about this. 2018, so they don't have anybody in 16, they don't have anybody in 17. 2018, Dwayne Haskins finishes 3rd in a 3-man race with Kyler Murray and Tua Tagovailoa. That really, I mean, there was a race there for a while. And then 2019, they have 3 guys in the top 10, 3 in the top 6. Justin Fields is 3rd. Chase Young is 4th. J.K. Dobbins is 6th. 2020, Justin Fields is 7th in that weird COVID year. I have thoughts on that. 2021, C.J. Stroud finishes 4th. 2022, C.J. Stroud finishes 3rd. And 2023, Marvin Harrison Jr. finishes 4th. So those are 12 guys in 10 years. 12 guys in 17 years, 10 of the 17, there was somebody for Ohio State who was in the mix. Pretty good, right? Again, like, there are good. Penn State is looking at this going, what? Like, good programs. Are they not? Texas is looking at this going, what? They're complaining that there hasn't been an Ohio State Heisman Trophy winner in the last 17 years, but they have 12 guys in those 17 years who finished in the top 10. What are we doing here?
I don't know that we're complaining. I think we're merely pointing it out, making folks aware of it.
Maybe fans were complaining. Yeah, no, we're just.
I mean, I'm sure Ohio State would love to put a new Heisman Trophy in the lobby at the Woody. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Troy Smith, 801 first place votes when he won in 2006. And that's like, even that idea, to talk about Troy here very briefly. Things happened that year that Troy wound up being one of the most overwhelming Heisman winners of all time, and was not a first round draft pick, right? He had a lot of juice coming into the year. Ohio State was a preseason number 1, but I think Adrian Peterson got hurt that year. That was sort of like the other guy who was sort of going to be in that mix. And then things kind of just happened and broke their way. And Ohio State beats Michigan in the 1-2 game at the end of the year. And they're the undefeated number 1 team in the country. And it's like, I think Craig Krenzel might have won the Heisman in 2006. If he was the quarterback of the undefeated number 1 Ohio State Buckeyes, who were number 1 all year, beat the number 2 team twice, and just won a game against Michigan that everybody in college football watched. Troy is spectacular. But the way that season shook out, the Ohio State quarterback, Braxton Miller, probably would have won the Heisman that year. JT Barrett probably would have won the Heisman that year. Dwayne Haskins probably would have won the Heisman that year, with the combination of where Ohio State was in the sport, the kind of season they had as a team, because Troy's stats were not through the roof, right? His stats, I don't think, were even as good as they had been necessarily in previous years, but he was a consummate leader, a consummate professional, the exact guy that you want leading the number 1 team in the country. And then a lot of other candidates fell by the wayside, and he was one of the biggest runaway winners ever. But like, a lot of things happened in his favor.
Yeah, no, they did. But I also like the way people vote is different now too, right? Like, it's not that profile, I think, used to be what people looked for, right? It wasn't necessarily, statistics matter clearly, but like at that time, even still, and probably maybe a couple of years beyond that with Tim Tebow, it felt like less about cumulative stats and more about like leader of the best team in the country, not necessarily like, and like now, like I don't think a guy like Troy Smith will ever win the Heisman Trophy again, because if there's a guy at another school that went 9-3, but he threw for 5,000 yards and 40 touchdowns, like that guy's going to win.
Because who was Troy last year? JJ McCarthy?
Yeah.
And he finished 10th? And people just turned it off.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Hey, I was watching. You white guys watch Kings of Columbus.
Statistical output is what we're talking about, not numbers.
2340. Lesmerises says JJ McCarthy is Troy Smith. And I never watched the show again. And then I went to his house and I rang his doorbell and I punched him in the neck. Statistical output. And also, like, Troy's statistical output is better. But the point that we're making is I did not like that era of the Heisman Trophy, because there was an era before Troy where people were like, ooh, air raid offense, Andre Ware, BYU guys, they must be the best player. And it's like, are they? It's just your kind of like lower mid-level school said, chuck it, who cares? We're just going to throw the ball like maniacs. And Heisman voters were like, acted like the forward pass had just been invented. I don't think that's what it should be. No. I would much rather vote for leader of the best team than 55 than Case Keenum. Oh, now Case Keenum didn't win the Heisman. You know what? Like that was a model there for a little bit of time.
Well, didn't you voted Trevor Lawrence's last year, right? I think probably with a similar idea, but I don't think he came close to winning the Heisman that year. But I think that argument was probably more similar to the Troy Smith argument. I know Clemson didn't win the national title that year, but it was like really, really good. Like this guy is the best quarterback in college football, regardless of what the numbers tell you.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So we wanted to lay out a little bit of where Ohio State has been in the Heisman race, but really as a Caleb Downs conversation, the most important part of this conversation before we wind up ranking Ohio State's 10 best candidates since Troy Smith, it's a defensive conversation, right? Bill, that's the conversation we have to have. How realistic is it for a guy who's a safety to win the Heisman? And I said, you do that, right? I said, you do that?
I did. I looked it up.
You did it?
I got some notes.
So let's go there. How realistic is it for a safety to win the Heisman? Let's start there with the research that you did. Like, did you get to the end of this and be like, yeah, he can win? Or did you get to the end and be like, I think we should cancel this show?
I didn't get through it and think like, yeah, he could win. I got through it and think like there is a path for him to be in the conversation. But even like, we're talking about some of the best defensive players in the history of college football that we're going to talk about. And like, they were really good, but they didn't really get all that close to actually winning the Heisman Trophy, even if they were in the conversation. So like, it is very, I mean, people know this, it's very much an uphill battle.
So before we get to the specifics, if you were a defensive player trying to win the Heisman, and again, since Charles Woodson in 97, 25 defensive players. I think I said it reversed before. 25 defensive players in the top 10 in the last 26 years, 7 in the top 5. Would you rather be a defensive back or an edge rusher or a middle linebacker or a running back catching tackle accumulating linebacker? Positionally, which type of defensive player would you want to be if you were making a run at this?
I would probably want to be a defensive back because that body type and skill set, I think, gives you a better chance of doing some other things besides playing defense.
Okay. Do you want to run through the 7 guys in the top 5 since 1998?
Sure.
And do a little bit of the research that you found there. I will say before we get started there, 25 defensive players since 1998, finishing in the top 10, 2 Buckeyes. Can I trivia question you on this? So we know one of them, who's one of the Ohio State defensive players to finish in the top 10 is
Chase Young.
Chase Young in 2019. Do you know the other?
Like all time?
Since 98.
Oh, since 98.
Since 98. Since the defensive Heisman.
That would have been after Katzenmoyer, right?
Yes.
I don't know.
I forgot. I covered this and forgot about it. AJ Hawk, 2005, finished 6th, which is pretty good for an off-ball line.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
It's like not sacks. That's not sacks. That's not picks. That's just running around and tackling guys.
Yeah.
So those are the 2 guys there. Okay, but that's not top 5. So we're talking about top 5 here. So who are the top 5 guys we're talking about here since Charles?
Yeah, we'll start. So 2009 was the first one after Charles Woodson. That was Ndamukong Suh from Nebraska. He finished 4th that year, and he was like a very famous player going into that 2009 season. More productive in 2009, I think, than he was in 2008. He had a bunch of tackles. He had 85 tackles, which is a boatload for a defensive lineman. 20 and a half tackles for loss, 12 sacks. Like, didn't lead the country in any of those categories. He did lead the country in pass breakups for a defensive lineman. He had 10. He did have an interception. He did not play any offense in 2009, but he did have a receiving touchdown in 2008. So that probably was, I don't know, at least in people's minds. But it was more of like, this guy is just an absolute freak kind of thing. And definitely had the statistical numbers to back it up, despite not playing any offense.
I felt like there was a little groundswell with him in 2009. I think this was one of the early conversations around, shouldn't we actually be voting for the best football player regardless of position? And I think people would have made the case that in 2009, he was the best player in college football. And I do think we're going to have some conversations here where some guys, what's the phrase? They walked so Caleb Downs could run. Like I think the ground is being the pump is being primed a little bit for some of this, and I think Sue is an important part of because Woodson, and we can talk about Woodson before we move off this topic, but Woodson's like a special case in a lot of ways. But just like, hey, let's acknowledge great defensive players. I think Sue was really important for that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I actually, honestly, like probably most of these guys fit that bill. Maybe one or two don't, but that's probably a necessary requirement to be a defensive player gets in this conversation. After Ndamukong Suh was Tyrann Mathieu in 2011, safety from LSU. Again, not prolific producer. 76 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, 2 interceptions. He did force a bunch of fumbles, and everyone like he captivated the country as the Honey Badger. Like, again, just like fame had a lot to do with it. I think he was an incredible player, but I think people just loved watching him play because of the way he played. It wasn't like he had 150 tackles and led the country in interceptions or anything like that. He was a special teams weapon. He returned 2 punts for touchdowns that year, including one in the SEC championship game against Georgia. LSU was undefeated that year. He was the SEC championship game MVP. So it was like the best player on one of the best defenses in the country, on maybe the best team in the country, and a guy who had a knack for making huge plays. And he ended up 5th in the Heisman voting in 2011. The following year,
I'm going to read from Wikipedia because sometimes that's where I do my research. In college, he developed a reputation for causing turnovers, setting an SEC record with 11 career forced fumbles and earning the nickname the Honey Badger after the mammal of the same name.
It wasn't just because he liked honey.
So, I say a lot of stupid stuff on here, and I just want to be clear when I'm saying something that sounds stupid, but it is not intentionally stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to give Caleb Downs a nickname?
Yes. Yeah. I don't know what it is, but
I don't think Tyrann Mathieu is a Heisman finalist if he's not the Honey Badger.
I think that's right.
I think his year he had 4 touchdowns. His year, I think he had 2. He had 2
punt returns, touchdowns, 2 fumble recoveries. Yeah.
So I do think Caleb Downs has to score. He has to get in the end zone one way or the other this year. But fame is quite a deal. And like the hunt, how, I don't know how it happened. Were you alive in 2011? What were you doing in 2011?
I was alive in 2011. Yeah, I was a senior in college. Yeah.
Okay. I was covering college football in 2011, but I think even back then I didn't care.
I had graduated college. I had graduated college by that football season.
I can't remember what I was doing. I guess this is also this is the year when Ohio State football exploded. So it was a little bit of a different thing. Usually you're very aware of the national scene because Ohio State's right in the thick of it. This was the year where you're just wondering if Ohio State could avoid getting an extra point block so they don't lose to Purdue. So I wasn't as locked in on the Tyrann Mathieu thing. Fame, brother. Whole mama fame. There's some stuff to be learned here for Caleb Downs, but I think the number one thing is get a nickname. So we will work on that.
Yeah. And I think fame is, maybe with all 3 of these guys, right? Because Manti Te'o was also among the most famous players in college football when he came back in 2012. Historically prolific Notre Dame defender, not ranked fine nationally in a lot of categories, but I think he was on a very short list of Notre Dame players who had 300 career tackles coming back for that season. And then was the heart and soul for what people thought probably for much of the year was the best defense in the country until they played Alabama. But that was after the Heisman Trophy voting. So that didn't impact anything. It was just made a bunch of tackles. He was the man. Obviously there was the story with his fake girlfriend that I think captivated a lot of people. The one thing that he did have on the field that was a little noteworthy was he had 7 interceptions that year, which is a lot for a linebacker. So I think that probably popped out to a lot of people, but it was just another case of returning very famous player who had a very good season on a very good team. And that catapulted him he was second that year in the Heisman Trophy voting in 2012.
I voted for him.
Yeah.
And I was very vociferous in making the case of this is a national championship caliber team because they were one of the two teams that made the national title game. They were a defense first team, and he was the quarterback, leader, and best player of that defense. So what are we looking for? He's the engine of a championship level team. And it just so happens that this is a defense first team. So why would you view him as the middle linebacker or potentially Caleb Downs as the safety who kind of pulls the whole defense together? Why should we view them any differently than we would view a quarterback on an offense first team? I think if it's obviously a different position. I think this is a fairly good comparison for Caleb Downs if Ohio State truly is going to be a defense first team this year. Do you think that there's and then again, if Johnny Manziel, if Texas A&M doesn't upset Alabama, I think Manti Te'o might have won the Heisman.
I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah.
So in a world where we're going to talk, the field is a little iffy right now nationally, I think this is the Downs path in a lot of ways to winning.
No, I think so too. Which I think it's worth having the conversations, even if we think like he's not going to play any offense at all, because Ohio State is probably going to have the best defense in the country. If Ohio State wins a national championship, it's going to be on the back of its defense. And I don't it's not because of the offense is going to be bad. Just like look at the roster. The defense is going to be excellent. It's going to be the best thing about this team. And Caleb Downs has a very reasonable chance of being its best player. So that's one path. There are other paths for which makes the conversation a little more compelling, I guess, is like he might have multiple paths to being in this conversation. But there's definitely one that exists without him playing any offense at all. And it's this one.
Okay. All right. What's next?
The other path, which is Jabril Peppers in 2016. I actually had forgotten that he was in the top 10 in the Heisman voting. He finished fifth that year in 2016.
And got to New York.
Got to New York. And Jabril Peppers was a very, very, very famous high school player. And that followed him throughout. Like he went to Michigan. It was a huge deal. So like he arrived with a level of notoriety that is probably a little more common now as a freshman, but even in 2016, I think was maybe a little rare. And or excuse me, not in 2016, but when he got to Michigan was a little rare, and I think like that helped him in 2016 because people were just sort of like, oh, what's up with Jabril Peppers? But very good year in 2016. 72 tackles, 16 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, and interception. And the big wild card here is that he played 53 offensive snaps for Michigan that season. 29 of them were a wildcat quarterback. The rest were either like pure running back or a little bit of receiver.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Do you want Caleb Downs to play wildcat quarterback for Ryan Day's offense this year? Is that what you're saying?
I actually don't. No.
Okay.
I don't. I don't. If Caleb Downs is getting the ball, I don't want it to be in a situation where a defensive tackle can hit him. I want it to be on the edges of the defense. On the edge of the defense.
Hey Ryan, again, great win for the Buckeyes today. Do you regret at all putting your All-American safety at wildcat quarterback, where 2 defensive tackles wishboned him and ended his season? You have any regrets there? Okay.
Yeah.
That's where you were. Okay.
I draw the line there. But so Jabril Peppers did play 53 snaps on offense. He had 29 total offensive touches. He scored 3 touchdowns on offense. He scored a touchdown on special teams as a punt returner. He returned punts and kicks and played offense and was an incredibly productive and versatile defensive player for Michigan. So like he was checking a lot of boxes there on the field and off the field for Michigan that season.
So let's have the conversation. Let's have this conversation right here because it's the example. How would you use Caleb Downs on special teams and offense this year if you were the coach?
I would definitely have him return some punts. I don't think he'd be my punt returner all the time. And he was not the punt returner all the time for Alabama last year. Kool-Aid McKinstry did it for most of the season. And then Caleb Downs did it like the last 3 or 4 games. He only had 4 punt returns all year. So I would put him back there sometimes. And then Yeah, like Ryan Day said, like they tossed him a couple of option pitches during spring practice. I think to maybe see what that would look like. That's what I would do. Like sweeps, stuff on the perimeter, let them run against DBs and linebackers, and just I don't want you to line up in the power eye with Caleb Downs at running back and run him into the teeth of a defense. I think that would be silly. I have a hard time stomaching putting him in offense at all, because he's so good and so valuable, and they are actually in a little bit of a precarious situation as far as safety depth goes. But I don't think it's wholly unreasonable to play him on offense. But if you're going to do it, it would be like, yeah, pitches and sweeps and stuff on the outside, stuff outside the hashes, outside the numbers, kind of stuff.
Throw him a couple, just like get him in space, right? That's
throw him a bubble. Probably have him out there with multiple running backs, like he and Travion, he and Quinshawn, maybe all three, like whatever you want to do, but like nothing that all the way telegraphs that he's definitely getting the ball. Although I think most teams would probably assume he is if he's on the field on offense, but he's got to be really careful with it. That's what's scary about it for me. It's like you can't. If anything were to happen to him using him on offense, like Ryan Day would have people with pitchforks and torches at his door. And you can't live scared, right? Like you have a really good football player, and you should maximize the way you want to use him. I understand there's a balance there, but I do think they need to be smart about it.
It did feel like in 16 that like Jabril Peppers was like a magical, indescribable football player. He's even a linebacker / safety in our graphic, because he was like that nickel safety DB that he was kind of in the box sometimes he wasn't. He was physical, but he also could defend guys in the pass game. And then he was this return, like that was part of the aura around him, and Michigan chose to do it. Like you have to choose to give a guy an opportunity to develop a what's he gonna do aura. Now you can have I'm a great player aura. And I like in the pros, that's different. You're millionaires. You're trying this is a very college football kind of thing to me. To create and again, we talk about this a lot on Kings of the North because you think Travis Hunter is a very interesting Heisman candidate at Colorado this year. Now, the difference there is Colorado needs Travis Hunter to be both a receiver and a cornerback because he's their best cornerback and he's probably one of their 2 or 3 best receivers, right? Because they don't have the same talent level. Ohio State doesn't need this. But is the pursuit...
That's a very important part of this conversation, is that Michigan's best offensive player that year was probably Jake Butt, and its quarterback was Wilton Speight.
Oh, that's not good, bro. This is 2016 Michigan that almost came in and beat Ohio State in the shoe. Like this is
because his defense was awesome. It was because of its offense.
What actually we probably should do is go back in time and have Curtis Samuel play like 100 defensive snaps in 2016, and then he could have been a Heisman finalist. They should have just played. It should have just been one-on-one Curtis Samuel versus Jabril Peppers, and like let's go here because neither team. Those teams were the number 2 and 3 teams in the country going into the 2016 game, and they each had one player who could, with the ball in his hands, who could do anything. Oh man, Wilton Speight, woo! Is the pursuit of college football magic a worthy pursuit, even if your team doesn't need it to win? Right, like Chris Gamble at Ohio, Trust was like, man, we gotta cover some people and do like they needed that, right? This is not that. Yeah. This is all extra. This is all pixie dust. But do we not live in a world where there's room for that in college football anymore, or in an NIL world, in a world where guys are trying to get? Because Caleb Downs wants this, so I think he's up for it. Can't Ohio State pursue this just because it's cool and interesting? And absolutely the Heisman race is part of that. But you elevate Caleb Downs from, man, hey, that guy's a great player, to you never forget that guy, to, man, like that, he's that talented. I think it's a worthy pursuit. You think it is foolhardy, and when he is tackled by 4 300-pound guys and has 1,200 pounds of linemen laying on him. In like the Iowa game, we can run this clip back and you can point your finger at me.
No, I do think that is a worthy pursuit. But even with that, like you still worry about it, right? Like wouldn't you even be a little bit worried about exposing Caleb Downs in that way? I think that's fair and reasonable to be worried about it. It's not. I think part of the thing that sort of got like, and I guess it's maybe just a byproduct of how information is disseminated. It's like I think too many people reacted to Ryan Day saying what he said about Caleb Downs as like Caleb Downs is going to be our third running back. Like we're gonna give it to Travion and Quinton, and then Caleb Downs is gonna have 50 carries next year because he's our third running back. Like that's not what he said.
No.
If it and like even like a Jabril Peppers kind of workload that he had that season, I think would be too much for Caleb Downs. I would not want to put the ball in his hands that many times. But if you can find a way to manufacture a couple of touchdowns for him on off, and like I'm not saying like the defense is still going to try to stop him, but like try to get him a couple touchdowns on offense and put him back a punt returner enough times that maybe he breaks one, which would require a philosophical shift on Ohio State's part, by the way, because they just don't return a lot of punts. They fair catch basically everything. Then I'm fine with that. I think I'm okay with that. Like that I do think that is a worthy pursuit. I think that at a time where we're frankly losing a lot of what college football is and what people I think loved about college football, why not embrace something like that? Because it is a uniquely college thing.
Now we're at can Caleb Downs save college football? That's where we've crossed over to. I am in favor of pursuing magic. So I'm for this, and I think there's a way that you can do it. The last three guys on this defensive list certainly are not at all like Caleb Downs as players, but with these three guys, are there still any lessons to be learned, do you think?
I think the Chase Young thing is probably a similar to the Manti Te'o thing, like best player on the best defense that year, because Ohio State's defense was awesome that year, and then Chase Young was a tour de force who would have been even better had he not had to miss 2 games, but he led the country in I think both sacks and tackles for loss that season despite missing 2 games. And there was like a bit of mystique around him that year. It was just like, can't do anything to stop this guy kind of thing. Aiden Hutchinson, less so. Like Aiden Hutchinson was probably the best player on maybe the best defense in 2021, but less of a cumulative argument than a Chase Young, and certainly less of a cumulative argument than Will Anderson, who finished behind Aiden Hutchinson in the Heisman voting in 2021, despite like dwarfing him in every statistical category. Will Anderson had 102 tackles and 34 and a half tackles for loss in 2021 and 17 and a half sacks. He had 10 more tackles for loss than the next closest player. Like he was, I think, without a doubt, the best defensive player in college football that year. But Alabama, I don't know, for whatever reason, wasn't viewed as a typical Alabama defense that season. And Bryce Young kind of stole the shine from a lot of people on that team. So Aiden Hutchinson ended up getting a boost ahead of him, I think, because Michigan and its defense were probably a bit of a better story that season.
So Chase Young in 19, Aiden Hutchinson in 21, Will Anderson in 21. They're all edge guys. I do think the Aiden Hutchinson path might be the third path. So we talked about you're the best player on a defense-driven team, right? That's the Manti Te'o path. You're a great defensive player who also does enough other things with the ball in your hands that you have like a magical aura around you, and that's the Jabril Peppers path. And then I think the Aiden Hutchinson path is your team is very good, and it seems like you're the guy to vote for to represent your team, which I think which is a little different than like Manti Te'o, like he's the quarterback of the team. It's a little more of a default vote. That Aiden Hutchinson was very good, but I don't know that there was as much force behind Aiden Hutchinson as there was like, man, Michigan was good. They made the playoff. They beat Ohio State. And who are we going to vote for? Hassan Haskins? Who are we supposed to vote for on this team? Cade McNamara? Who is there to vote for? He's the best guy. Could Caleb Downs and just because there's so like if you did a poll at the end of the year, if this Ohio State football season goes as we think it might, how many different players do you think conceivably could get a vote as Ohio State's best player?
Oh, there's probably 4 or 5.
Oh, I was going to ask if it was 10. It's like, could you vote for both running backs, Emeka Ibuka, Jeremiah Smith? He's young, but man, he's a monster. JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, somebody like would be making a defensive tackle case.
Denzel Burke.
Sonny Styles, Denzel Burke. Let me tell you about Davis and Igbignosin, who I'm still beating the drums, going to have a huge year.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Hancock in the slot is the heartbeat of the team, and Caleb Downs. And it's like, well, we're at 10. And then within that, you're trying to say, well, this is a little bit, or maybe, now I guess the point is, to me, that would be like a little bit like Georgia in 2021. No, Georgia in 2021. I guess our point is there wasn't a Georgia guy in 2021 who finished in the top 10 of the Heisman. Jordan
Davis was ninth.
So that's not a good case. So if that's the case, like your team is so good, you have so many good players, we can't pick the guy. Caleb Downs could actually fit that as well, but if he fits that, he's not going to win. If that's what it is, Ohio State's so good, we just can't pick the guy, then Ohio State's leading Heisman vote getters is going to be 7th. Yeah. So that's actually not a bad case. It's like Hutchinson is like an elevated case of what happened with Georgia that year.
Yeah, I think that's right. It also wasn't like Bryce Young won, Hutchinson was second. Like Kenny Pickett was third. It's like, I guess. CJ Stroud was a very good, like had great numbers that year, but like Ohio State had lost to Michigan, wasn't playing for a Big Ten title, didn't make the playoff. It was like Kenneth Walker, Matt Corral was in the top 10 that year. Desmond Ridder was in the top 10 that year. Breece Hall was 10th, and Jordan Davis was 9th in a year where people were trying to make the Ndamukong Suh case for him. We're like, this is the best player in college football. You need to vote for this guy, even though he played like 250 snaps that year.
Yeah, less than half their snaps. So yeah. So let's wrap up this specific defensive player winning the Heisman case with that idea. If a dominant quarterback emerges for a national championship contender, then a defensive player is not going to win. Well, I take that back because Peyton Manning was just sitting. People are just sick of Peyton Manning. Charles Woodson Peyton Manning thing is still crazy. Like it's just like the we're sick of. There's no we're sick of that guy vote. But the thing that we were talking about before the show, Bill, was the top 10 finishers in the Heisman last year. How many are back this year in college football?
Just 2. Ollie Gordon, the running back from Oklahoma State, and Jalen Milroe, the quarterback at Alabama. So
it's open. So that I think is an important part of this. Now, if George is undefeated and Carson Beck throws for 4,500 yards, then that's an Ohio State defensive player, no matter how much offense he plays, is not going to beat that. If Texas goes undefeated and beats Georgia and Quinn Ewers is spectacular, then like that's not going to happen. If Jalen Milroe goes crazy at Alabama as the quarterback, then a defensive thing's not going to happen. Dylan Gabriel at Oregon as the quarterback, Riley Leonard at Notre Dame as the quarterback. But I think part of the point here is there isn't a Caleb Williams coming back or a CJ Stroud coming back or a Bryce Young coming back or a Trevor Lawrence who won a national championship as a true freshman just sitting there for another 2 years, right? There have been a lot of, we're in this world now where underclassmen win the Heisman all the time. It is that part of it that I think amplifies to a large degree why this discussion is even worth having, because it feels wide open. And if you tell me that Carson Beck is the Heisman favorite, which he is right now, I'm like, okay, well, I can see paths to beating that. Right now on FanDuel, the Heisman odds, Carson Beck is plus 750, Quinn Ewers is plus 900, Dylan Gabriel 10-1, Will Howard 13-1. The number 4 Heisman candidate is Ohio State's quarterback, and you and I just have never been there. That like the path, that's sort of maybe the line in the sand for me. That if Will Howard winds up being like the leading Heisman candidate, well, then Caleb Downs is the leading Heisman candidate in our scenarios, right? No offense to Will Howard, but like Will Howard's not going to throw for 4,500 yards and 50 touchdowns.
He's not, but he could throw for like 35 touchdowns and run for another 10. Like that's the thing to keep in mind with Will Howard. Is like he was a pretty good runner. Obviously, Kansas State, we talk about it a lot. Like he has that to add to his game, which Ohio State has not had at the quarterback position since Justin Fields in terms of like formulating a Heisman Trophy candidacy platform. So it's not. I understand why Will Howard is there because he's the Ohio State quarterback, or going to be the Ohio State quarterback. But I personally don't think I'd have him. I probably have him like 3rd at best among Ohio State's best candidates.
Who would your list be right now then?
I would probably put both running backs ahead of him, and then maybe go to Will Howard, and then I don't know. I might go to a defensive player from there. Caleb Downs probably.
So you do not believe, as we sit here, that Caleb Downs is Ohio State's best Heisman candidate?
No, it's just a really hard thing to say about a defensive player,
I think
right?
I'd say it. I think I'm ready to say it. I think
Well,
the magic sprinkle was enough for me in a defense first world where the running backs are going
yeah,
to split carries
split,
and
right?
the receivers are going to spread it around. And I just think Will Howard is going to be good, but not spectacular.
Reasonable. Like I wouldn't push back against any of that. Like too hard. It's just I think there's a like Quinshon Judkins with like 1,300 yards and a bunch of touchdowns because he's the guy that finishes every Ohio State scoring drive would be pretty tough to beat, and I think that's like pretty likely to happen. Like I don't know. I don't know who between Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins I think is going to finish with more rushing yards. I think that Quinshon Judkins is going to finish with a lot more rushing touchdowns. So like he could have like Blake Corum had like 25 rushing touchdowns last year, and like all of them were like 5 yards or fewer.
Yeah.
Like Quinshon Judkins could do something like that, where people just like, oh, that guy's got almost 30 rushing touchdowns. I'm voting for him.
Yeah. We did, I think it might have been in February, a draft of the best Northern Heisman candidates on Kings of the North. This is how that draft went. You took Dylan Gabriel, the Oregon quarterback. I took Cam Rising, the Utah quarterback. You took Travis Hunter, two-way player for Colorado. I took Shadur Sanders, the Colorado quarterback. You took Riley Leonard, Notre Dame quarterback. I took Travion Henderson. You took Quinshon Judkins, back-to-back as the Ohio State running backs. I took Donovan Edwards, the Michigan running back. You took Jordan James, the Oregon running back. And I took Garrett Green, the West Virginia quarterback. And reading that list makes me sure that Caleb Downs will win the Heisman.
Yeah, that's probably right.
And I just think there's opportunity here, and I would pursue it. If I'm Caleb Downs and Ohio State, it's like you don't want to not have the main thing be the main thing, and we all know what the main thing is here for Ohio State. But I think you can sidecar this and not have the motorcycle run off the road. I don't think you are significantly risking beating Michigan, making the playoff, winning the national championship, natty or bust, because you give Caleb Downs 25 offensive touches. And so, and then I do think, I said this a lot with Georgia. I wanted Georgia to tell us who to vote for. You're a great team. Who's your Heisman candidate? So this is going to be on Ohio State a little bit, because we'll talk about this in the Heisman candidacy. He's like, if you split it, nobody's going to win.
Yeah.
So if Ohio State has the three best Heisman candidates in the country, none of them are going to win. Ohio State has to coalesce, and there has to be a campaign. I mean, honestly. So like they're going to have to make some decisions here potentially if this is a spectacular season filled with spectacular players. They can't tie for the Heisman. So
yeah.
Who do we vote for? I was waiting in 21. Who do we vote for, Georgia? I kind of want to vote for Nakobe Dean. Will you tell me that he's your candidate so I can make the Manti Te'o case for Georgia's linebacker and not their defensive tackle who plays 38% of their snaps? And Georgia never did squat. They were too busy running around trying to make sure guys weren't driving 115 miles an hour to put together or formulate a Heisman case for anybody. So I think that matters. I don't mean to be stupid about it. I think that matters.
We were having some of those conversations about Ohio State in 2021, weren't we? Like it was like who's Ohio State's Heisman candidate? CJ Stroud or like Garrett Wilson?
Right.
I think I said it on Garrett. I think I voted for Garrett Wilson that year. I think that's kind of where I landed. But there was a question about it, and like Ohio State has never really gotten behind a guy other than Marv last year. They did when Marv probably didn't have much of a shot to do it, but like. Prior to that, when I think there were guys with much better chances of actually winning it, like there was not much of a push from Ohio State to remind people of it.
Yeah. Yeah. They tried to get, they got some CJ stuff going right at the point where Ohio State lost to Michigan. I was like, well, now CJ's not going to win. So, yeah. Okay. So now we're going to talk about sort of times when at this point in the year, it felt like Ohio State had a great Heisman Trophy candidate, and then it got sideways a little bit. And then we're going to list Ohio State's 10 best Heisman Trophy candidates since Troy Smith and where Caleb Downs could fit into that mix. We'll do all of that next on Kings of Columbus. Back on Kings of Columbus doing this this Heisman discussion. And Bill, I can remember writing a story at Cleveland.com while Terrell Pryor was in school, basically saying that the Ohio State quarterback is always a Heisman candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was not long after Troy Smith, and I've told this story a million times. I can very clearly remember sitting in the Jack Nicklaus Museum where we used to have Ohio State coach and player midweek news conferences because they were trying to get people to go to the Jack. You ever been to the Jack Nicklaus Museum on Ohio State's campus, Bill?
I actually have not. I've never been there. No.
You should go. It's a museum to one of the 10 greatest athletes in American history. It's just there, and nobody goes. That's where we had I think that's right. That's where the Gordon Gee, I just hope Jim Tressel doesn't fire me news conference was held.
Yeah.
And it's like, here's the 18th hole flag where Jack Nicklaus from the Masters in 1986, when Jack Nicklaus completed the greatest moment in golf history. And here's the moment when Gordon Gee ruined the entire Ohio State football program right here, right next to each other. This is how. So I can remember being in there and asking Todd Beckman about being a Heisman candidate. And I think even Todd Beckman laughed. And I was like, I need to get better at this job. So, when you're the Ohio State quarterback, brother, like it's a land of opportunity. And this was even back in the day when like the Ohio State quarterback, they didn't throw the ball really, right? Like that, like, so I want to run through some, here's the site. It's called sportsoddshistory.com. And it has tabs for all kinds of different, it has like an NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, NHL, college football, college basketball, golf, tennis, soccer, all these different tabs. And so like in college football, you can look back to 2001 in terms of like odds to, I think, win the national title. You can look at season win total odds back to 2005, and you can look at preseason Heisman odds back to 2009, and not just preseason, but like every week during the season. Like it tracks like what the betting odds were like week 2, week 3, as guys went up and down during the year. So that's what I use. It's so good. And just a couple guys who had Heisman candidacies that probably aren't going to make our list as who wound up being great Ohio State Heisman candidates, but guys that were being talked about the way you and I are talking about Caleb Downs for 2 hours right now. So one of them I want to talk about is 2008 Beanie Wells. This is the first one. This is like post Troy. In the summer, he was 4-1. He was the second favorite in the summer of 2008 to win the Heisman, behind only Tim Tebow, who was like the most famous player in college football. And he got hurt. So like this was like there is this sort of, and I've done this before on some shows, sort of like Ohio State curses. Beanie Wells, again, that whole year of all those guys come back. James Laurinaitis and Malcolm Jenkins and Brian Robisky and Alex Boone and Marcus Freeman, all those guys come back after losing back-to-back national title games in 06 and 07. They come back in 08 and gear up for this huge 2008 season. And then Ohio State goes to USC. It's like Beanie's hurt. Is Beanie going to play? We're not sure. I don't know. And then he doesn't play and they get waxed by USC. And it's like, well, there goes that. But like at this point in time, because Beanie was coming off like a 1,600-yard season in 2007. How, like an Ohio State running back who destroyed people in 2007 for a team that had made the last 2 national title games. And he's back with a veteran-laden team as sort of like the focus of the offense. How good of a candidacy is that, at least in the summer?
It's about as good as it gets. It's pretty good.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
And then it was terrible. Beanie's injury, man, like could have been guys from the Beanie Wells that existed in 06 as a true freshman, spin move against Michigan, the 07 season, 39 carries against Michigan, and the 07 game, and just destroying people. And then like what could have been, and it winds up being injury riddled, and then end of the first round of the NFL, injuries there, the lawsuit, like just a terrible end to a guy who was super talented. So anyway, I wanted to mention Beanie Wells as a Heisman candidate. Terrell Pryor. I told this story before, like when Terrell Pryor got here, it was like, he's either going to like win the Heisman and lead Ohio State to a national championship and we be one of the all-time great Buckeyes, or like it's going to blow apart around him. And it wound up being the latter of those two things. But in 2009, going into his sophomore year, at this point, he was 10-1. He was the 4th favorite in the offseason behind Tim Tebow, Colt McCoy, and Sam Bradford. Which is like, man, like Terrell Pryor's right there. 2010 in the offseason, he's 6-1. He's the 2nd favorite behind reigning Heisman winner Mark Ingram. Terrell Pryor, man. You heard of him, right?
I have heard of him. Yeah. Good player.
I know people, this is like one of these things people talk about. It's like Terrell Pryor, like in a different offensive system. If you did some stuff with him, like, let him throw it a little bit more, like really. And it's one of these things where I think there are 2 Heisman examples here. What Cam Newton did and became in college and the NFL is maybe what you thought Terrell Pryor was going to be. And what Lamar Jackson did and became is maybe what you thought Braxton Miller was going to be. At least the peak. It's like, what would that look like? It's not like we don't have versions of it, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to be dismissive of how uber talented Lamar Jackson and Cam Newton are. We're talking about guys who won the Heisman and won like NFL MVPs, right? Like, I mean, this is ridiculous. They've been like, it's so to be like, oh yeah, Terrell Pryor and Braxton Miller. I thought they both were. So I don't want to be dismissive of that, but that's what it would have looked like. Is that unfair to make those comparisons?
No, I don't think so. No, I think they're very, very strong comparisons for both those guys.
Okay. Let's talk about Braxton Miller then as a Heisman guy. So in 2012, he was not like a preseason guy, but by week 9 of that year, he was plus 450 and was the 4th favorite by week 9. So that's like when Ohio State in 2012 is going through this undefeated season where they're bowl banned and Braxton Miller is the entire offense. So coming off his freshman year and that weird, crazy year where he was sharing time with Joe Bosnerman and they had a losing record, going into 2012, he wasn't that, but he got there. During the course of 2012, he became a very legitimate Heisman candidate. Then in 2013, he's the favorite. He's the preseason favorite. He's 3-1 in 2013. And then in 2014, in June, before he gets hurt, he's 5-1. He's the 3rd favorite behind Jameis Winston and Johnny Manziel. No. Jameis Winston and Marcus Mariota, the guy who had won the previous Heisman and the guy who would go on to win that Heisman. Braxton Miller, before he gets hurt, is the 3rd favorite. So he's the favorite in 2013. And, if they win the Big Ten champion, I don't think he would have won the Heisman the way that whole season unfolded. But I want to talk about this at least briefly as we talk about derailed. JT Barrett, as a guy who didn't play college football at all in 2013 because he was redshirting and coming back from his high school injury, finished 5th in the Heisman voting in 2014. People did not know who he was before that season nationally. If Braxton Miller had been healthy in 2014 and Ohio State has the same season, I think he wins the Heisman.
Probably, yeah, I think so. Who 2014 was
Marcus Mariota,
Derrick Henry, Marcus Mariota,
Melvin Gordon, Amari Cooper.
Yeah, Amari Cooper. Yeah, because Ohio State beat all 3 of them. That's right, on the way to the national championship. Yeah, I think you're right. I think Braxton would have won the Heisman that year. Because
I think there's like a Troy case. You're the quarterback. You're the leader of the best team in the country. But then there's also like a magic. We're talking about magic. Who's more magical than Braxton Miller in recent Ohio State history, right? And he's super famous. Yeah. So
can I wasn't covering 2014 was my first season covering Ohio State, so I didn't cover the 13th season. Why did Braxton finish 9th in the Heisman voting as a quarterback who threw for 2,000 yards and rushed for 1,000 yards?
You mean like why? Like that his stats weren't gigantic? Why did he even?
No,
finish
why?
ninth?
Yeah,
why didn't he finish higher?
Like why did Bryce Petty finish ahead of him? Why did AJ McCarron finish ahead of him?
Yeah, I mean, that Michigan game comes down to the wire in 13. There's a lot of the it's the Carlos Hyde Braxton Miller show. I think I have a terrible memory. You start getting picked apart a little bit, right? That you're the favorite. And in 2012, when he winds up finishing 5th, like he finishes lower than he did the year before. after being the preseason favorite, you start getting picked apart a little bit. And I think we started slipping into conversations about like, how well does this guy really throw the ball? Right. And he's spectacular. And as a run threat at quarterback, there's nobody better. But now we're in year 2 of this, and he's only throwing for like 175 yards a game when there's other guys putting up much bigger numbers. So I think that's a big part of it is he didn't take necessarily the next big step as a thrower that people were expecting, even though he's a human highlight film. Yeah. So your instinct is he should be higher.
Yeah. Jameis, the quarterbacks that you're ahead of him were Jameis Winston, who won, obviously, AJ McCarron, Jordan Lynch at Northern Illinois, Johnny Manziel, Bryce Petty, and Derek Carr.
Yeah. Jordan Lynch ran for more yards even than Braxton did. And it's one of those things. And that annoys me. As much as I love what the Heisman is and the magical part of it, I hate this MAC player's really good part of the Heisman argument. Like, what an it's like, is he really? Could he start for Purdue? Could he start for Purdue? Could he start for Purdue? Or no, he couldn't start for Purdue. So he's accounting for 400 yards a game in the MAC because he couldn't start for Purdue. And you're voting for him from the Heisman, you're really going to vote for him. Let's do it right now. Parking lot game right now. I don't like hypotheticals when we're voting like for top 25. Parking lot game. Jordan Lynch, Braxton Miller. Who are you taking?
I'll take Braxton, please. Yeah.
You're gonna take Jordan Lynch? You voted for him ahead of Braxton Miller? Because why? Because why did you do it? Because he's better? Because his team is better? Why? Because Braxton ran for 91 yards a game and Jordan Lynch ran for 123? And that's it? Like, what are we doing? That part of it. And there's, as much as I hate Heisman voters, those, the underdog never, like, let's vote for a D3 guy who drives his tractor to practice. It's like, okay, Kate Stover drives his tractor to practice too. And he would beat you to death with his bare hands because he's a Division I football player at Ohio State.
Jordan Lynch was the country's second leading rusher in 2013 as a quarterback.
Braxton Miller would have run for 311 yards a game at Northern Illinois.
I know. Yeah, I know that. And that's the argument I would have made.
I just screamed at Jordan Lynch voters, and then you were like, I don't know. I think I would have voted for Jordan Lynch.
No, I mean, like, the numbers are crazy, but I would have made the same argument you just made. It's like, all right, put Braxton on Northern Illinois and tell me what that looks like.
Yeah. Okay. Who else? So that was like, so Braxton, like the 2014, what Braxton might have been is one that I'll always remember. I think, who else do I have on this list, Mike? 2015 Zeke is 9-1. This is a little bit like this year is, where there isn't an overwhelming favorite. Because as you can see on this list, there are times when the favorites are 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. So going into 2015, Ezekiel Elliott is 9-1. He's the second favorite. And I couldn't believe this when I read it, behind Trevon Boykin from TCU. Does that sound right to people's ears? What is happening here?
He was the favorite going into that year?
Yeah, I think.
He was really good. He was really good in 14, but
sportsoddeshistory.com. What do you want me to do, man? So like that's what it said. That Zeke, this is hard. That Zeke is, if you could take the end of 14 and the start of 15 for Zeke and like award a Heisman around this 12-game sample, he wins it going away.
Yeah.
Right. But he got going too late in 14. He's the second favorite going into 15. And then their offense looks like it's in mud inexplicably for most of 2015. We're talking about like, why aren't they better? Why aren't they better? Why aren't they better? Even though Zeke is putting up good stats, Bill, but like you covered this, like it's just as much as he was right there. And then it wound up being sort of a head-to-head battle because this is the year that Derrick Henry wins. And as good as Zeke's stats are, Derrick Henry's are better. And it's like, okay. But I feel like we're going through like derailed, right? It feels like maybe people like to make the case Ohio State should have another national championship, right? Since 14. There's enough circumstances here. I feel like they should have a Heisman since Troy. One of these guys should have broken through.
Yeah. And Zeke ran for like 1,800 yards that year, didn't he? Like it's not like he had, but he got 300 plus of that against Michigan. I guess it was like, and obviously the Michigan State game, he had, was it a staph infection he had? He was in the hospital, and then they didn't give him the ball enough, arguably. in that game. So it was like they lost the game that everyone was watching, and he had like 12 carries for like 30 yards or whatever it was. So on that kind of stage, which is like would be unfairly like that loss was not Ezekiel Elliott's fault, but I think maybe that got held against him a little bit too.
Going into the Michigan State game, thanks to sportsoddeshistory.com, Zeke was 5-1, Deshaun Watson was 5-1, and Derrick Henry was -200. So like Derrick Henry was still the favorite before Zeke. They lost the game and Zeke wasn't productive. So it wasn't like he had it in his hands and then lost it, but he was still in the mix. So again, it was very close there. What are a couple other more, Mike, that I have here on this list? Justin Fields in 2020 at 4-1 was the co-favorite before the year. And CJ Stroud in 2022 was the favorite at 2-1 going into the year. One of the other ones here, Bill, I think if there's no COVID, Justin Fields might win the Heisman in 2020.
Yep, I agree with that. I think that's right.
Because it just got so jacked up with the schedule and everything, but Justin Fields late in the year, and so this is the year that Devontae Smith kind of comes from nowhere and takes it. Even like Kyle Trask was the favorite in November, the Florida quarterback at one point. Mac Jones for much of that year was the Alabama candidate at quarterback instead of one of their receivers. Justin Fields is the co-favorite at 4-1 before the season. And like late in the year, week 11, week 12, week 13, he's like plus 125, plus 175, plus 175. He's less than 2-1 to win the Heisman. But what happens is canceled game, Indiana, canceled game, Michigan State, canceled game. And I think those cancellations, and by the way, he went nuts at the beginning of the year. His first 4 games, when he really kind of became the favorite, he averaged 302 passing yards per game and threw 13 total touchdowns. And he was completing 80% of his passes. And then he had a bunch of canceled games and like a couple off games. He threw for 199 against Michigan State and only threw for 114 against Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game. And that was it for him. But it was right there. And coming off what he was in 19, Ohio State still made the national championship game in 2020, but I think right. And then he had the weird game. Then he was like perfect. And then he had like a weird game. Was it the Indiana game where he like almost threw a couple picks or something?
So he was really good. Yeah. And then the Indiana game, he threw 3 interceptions. The next time they played was when they went up to East Lansing, and like he was the only player, the only starter who was available because the whole team tested positive for COVID. And then it was the Northwestern game in the Big Ten championship after that, which was like 3 weeks after that, I think, was the next time they played. And they were missing Garrett Wilson, I think, in that game.
Okay.
One of Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave did not play.
Yeah.
That was the Trey Sermon game. And then like against Clemson, he was awesome, but by then it was too late.
Yeah. So, and then CJ Stroud as a candidate, he was 10-1 in 2021, and he was a 4th favorite. Going into the Michigan game in 2021, he was -200. He was the odds-on favorite. Bryce Young was plus 110, and then they don't lose. Then they lose to Michigan, and Bryce Young like leads a miracle comeback and saves Alabama against Auburn, and that's it. But again, like he was not a preseason favorite, but he was the less than even money favorite after 11 games of the season is where CJ Stroud was in 2021. And in 2022, he's the favorite in the preseason. He's 2-1. Bryce Young's 4-1. And like, it just, he's the favorite again over Hendon Hooker, like in early November, late October, early November. He's the favorite after week 11. He's the favorite going into week 12. And then again, they lose to Michigan. So like CJ is right there as a favorite, and he's not derailed in the same kind of way as like a Beanie Wells injury or Justin Fields and COVID, or it just didn't happen for Pryor and Miller. But we understand if they would have beaten Michigan either of those years, CJ Stroud might have a Heisman, right? Yeah,
which is like, I think probably that is true, yes. And I don't disagree with that way of thinking for voters too. But it's like, oh, what happened in the games where CJ Stroud's Heisman candidacy got derailed? Like, oh, he threw for like 400 yards and 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, this is where the narrative part of it, it's the Ohio State Michigan game has such outsized importance in college football traditionally. And then, by the way, it was like the best regular season game. Take the uniforms off, and it's two of the best 3 teams in the country. It had such gravity that you just couldn't lose it and win the Heisman, which, like, who's the best player in those games? Who's the best football player on either team in 21 and 22? And then even like by the stats, by the performance, they didn't lose because of him. There were probably a couple plays we're not here to relitigate that. There were a couple plays to be made, right, at certain moments there. Yeah. But what he's doing in the NFL now is like, who's the best player in that game? 21 and 22, who's the best player in the Ohio State-Michigan game?
CJ Stroud.
And he couldn't win the Heisman. He finished third and fourth and third, but he couldn't win the Heisman because he didn't win the game. Okay, so now we're going to move to, this is to fit. So that's just, isn't that a walk down memory lane? Hey.
People really enjoyed that, yeah.
You know what's a good adjective for a graphic about a team that you love? Derailed.
Derailed.
Remember when you had such high hopes and then it went terribly wrong? Let's relive that. Multiple examples. But when you think about CJ Stroud, Troy Smith's 2006 wins the Heisman. Since then, Terrell Pryor, Braxton Miller, Ezekiel Elliott, Justin Fields, CJ Stroud. No Heisman. That was the point of that.
Yeah.
That's a little wild with how beyond their individual talent, which is immense, and the magic. How much magic's in there, brother? You feeling the magic with those 5?
It's a lot of magic. There's a lot of magic with those 5. Yeah.
And we're not even trying to back in with a receiver case for Marv. We're not trying to make a defensive case there. It's just like, what are they? They're quarterbacks and running backs. They're guys with the ball constantly. Super talented guys for a super famous, successful team. What happened? Oh, yeah, it didn't work out. That one of those 5 guys didn't win a Heisman is kind of mind-blowing. So let's do this list. This is my list, and you can disagree, of the best Heisman cases for Ohio State of the last since Troy won. Best. So it's this is more like you, and I'm trying to take circumstance out of it because the point is you can't control what other people do, and you can only control you. So I want to sort of say, well, like if you had done this and the circumstance had been slightly different, then you might have won. Because like Caleb Downs can only control. So we want to try to then, by the end of this, I want you to make a decision of where you think like the best version of a Caleb Downs season would fit on this list. Because the question we asked at the start is, could he not be Ohio State's best Heisman candidate since Troy, but still win this Heisman? So that's part of the case here. So we'll run through this real quick. I don't have all the stats right in front of me, but there's a lot of research for this show. But we'll make the general point. If you want to jump in and add stats, you're kind of the facts guy, Mr. Facts. Hey, Mr. Facts. Doug just says great stuff. All right, number 10 is something we didn't really talk about a ton, and what we brushed on was 2007 Beanie Wells, which is, I think, 1,600 yards plus. And the thing that's a little surprising about this, Bill, is that it is a 39 carry, I think 222 yard performance against Michigan, where he single-handedly destroys Michigan, propelling Ohio State into the national championship game, finishing off a season where he is like the driving force of this offense, and he doesn't finish in the top 10 in the Heisman voting.
Yeah. That I was shocked to see that because you had sent me this list beforehand, so I was going back through. I was like, oh, what was the case and where did he finish? I was like, oh, he didn't finish in the top 10. Okay,
what were we doing? I don't like this. Is it not a spectacular year? And doesn't it seem like all the time it's like, hey, why didn't CJ Stroud win the Heisman? It's like, oh, they didn't beat Michigan. It's like, oh, what happened to Beanie Wells? It's like, oh, they beat Michigan and he single-handedly destroyed them. Did he win it? Nope, not the top 10. I don't know.
Darren McFadden that year had 200 more rushing yards and 1 more touchdown than Beanie Wells did, and he finished second in the Heisman voting.
It's Arkansas. Is that because they invented that wild pig thing where they were wild pigging? They were wild pigging through. There was no, although he's Beanie. I can remember when like the whole conversation around Chris Wells. And he's like, well, my nickname's Beanie. It's like Chris Beanie Wells. And then he was like, you can just call me Beanie. We don't have to do this Chris thing anymore. So shouldn't a Beanie, he's got a nickname.
It's got a great nickname. Yeah.
Nickname destroyed Michigan, not in the top 10. I would love to go back and do a deep dive on relitigating this. And I don't know. I don't know what I was doing. They had lost to Illinois in week 11.
Were you voting that year?
I was maybe not, because I didn't get a vote right away, and I was mad and I was grumpy, and I was like, because the person who runs the Heisman vote for Ohio was running the vote back then, and it is inexplicable that this person runs. It's Bruce Hooley. Bruce Hooley is in charge of Ohio's Heisman voting. He's not a sports writer anymore. He doesn't cover college football. I've had arguments with the Heisman about this. He's in charge of who votes for the Heisman in Ohio. How many people are there in Ohio who cover college football for a living? Shouldn't one of them be in charge of it? I understand that he used to. He doesn't do it anymore. And they're like, no, we're good. I'm like, you're invalidating your entire process. But like you're like, we're good. Like, I'll do it. It's like, we hate you. I know that you hate me. Okay. Bill will do it. He's very likable. So anyway, I don't think I was voting quite yet. But Beanie, I think it's worth Beanie being on this list. Yes? Beanie 07.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Number 9 is CJ Stroud in 2022, because the whole thing was like CJ put up mind-boggling numbers in 2021, and then they didn't throw it as much in 2022, and like he hurt his own candidacy. So as much as I think it's possible that if they had beaten Michigan in 2022, he would have won the Heisman, like statistically, it's not as impressive as some other seasons here, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Very good season. Still one of the best Ohio State's had from a passer, but a step down from the year before.
But are you okay? Like, do you think like are you okay with this being this low, or does this feel too low for you, maybe?
No, the one thing I guess I was unsure of was like, we sent me the list, but didn't tell me whether or not you were taking into account the circumstance, because like, yes, this was a step back statistically for CJ, but also the field was not quite as impressive. Like he finished third behind Caleb Williams and Max Duggan that year.
Yeah.
Like that to me is, maybe he should have won it anyway that year, even if the numbers were not quite as good as they were the year before.
Yeah. Caleb Williams is a bad Heisman winner. Like, and I've covered that on a previous show. It's like, it's no offense to Caleb Williams, but normally you need to be on a playoff team. And like, he lost his biggest game and still won just on stats because there wasn't anybody else to give it to, because everybody else lost. Yeah. So I think part of the thing here is like, this is one of those, why could Caleb Williams lose the Pac-12 title game to Utah and still win the Heisman, but CJ Stroud can't lose to Michigan with better stats in that game? But I also like raw statistics, Caleb Williams is better than CJ here. So I think if CJ had even better raw stats through the course of that year, and as I've made the argument many, many, many times before, if you're not playing on conference championship weekend and getting that extra shot at the attention, it's very difficult. So even though Caleb Williams' team lost on conference championship weekend, at least he was playing, right? And like he kind of like tried to drag them to victory and they couldn't win, right? So he was like heroic in defeat when everybody was watching and CJ Stroud was home. But if CJ's stats were like through the roof, I think you still could have made somewhat of a better case, right?
Yeah, I think maybe if the wind wasn't blowing 50 miles an hour in Evanston that year, and CJ was able to throw for more than 76 yards in that game, he probably would have won the Heisman.
It's probably we're talking about derailment. Let's continue on the derailment standpoint. 8 is Braxton Miller in 2012, where this is like really good. He is the one-man offense of Ohio State. So I think you could maybe even argue for this to be higher on the list. But I do think we get to a point, Bill, when you're really starting to compare. I think it's hard for a quarterback I think he threw for like 166 yards a game in 2012. It's just a little rough of a case to make, even if you're magical and a great runner.
No, I think that's right. This was past the point where I think it just sort of became the expectation of the best quarterbacks, even quarterbacks who weren't necessarily like an air raid offenses. It's like there's a minimum passing production I think you have to meet, and it's certainly more than like 2,000 yards, whatever Braxton threw for that year.
So it's a very good case, but it's just I had it 8th here. 7th is Marv last year. And I want to make the case that going into week 12, so Ohio State's 11th game against Minnesota, Marv was the 4th favorite, but he wasn't that far behind the guy who eventually won, Jaden Daniels. Bo Nix was minus 110. Michael Penix was plus 375. And Jaden Daniels was 4-1. Marv's plus 550, 5.5 to 1 at this point. And against Minnesota, he has 3 catches for 30 yards. Yep. And if he had 13 catches for 230 yards in that game, I think he maybe could have won. It's like he was right because he's right there with Jaden Daniels. Penix beats Nix again, so Nix isn't going to win. Maybe this just means that Penix would have won, but like Marv was lurking. That was the best odds that he got to the whole year, according to the sports odds history, was like plus 550. And then right when he got to his most legitimate argument to win the Heisman, he had his least productive game.
Yeah, it was just like a big missed opportunity to pad the stats, right? No one is going to look back and say like, oh man, that Minnesota game was awesome, but they will look at the cumulative stats at the end of the year, and that just feels like a game where Marv should have like 10 catches for 150 yards and a couple touchdowns, right? And he did.
Yeah.
So,
all right, so now we're getting into a difficult area because there's context with each other that I tried to eliminate. J.K. Dobbins, I have 6th. J.K. Dobbins in 2019. He winds up with more than 2,000 rushing yards, but that includes the postseason. So we didn't have 2,000 rushing yards at the time of the Heisman vote. But Bill, this is like a run-first team, and he is awesome. And Ohio State is undefeated and in the argument to be the number 1 seed in the playoff. And his biggest challenge was he had 2 other guys on his teams who were better candidates, but just look at JK. Don't you think this is like a pretty good Heisman case in a vacuum?
Yeah, I like looked at your list initially. I was like, oh, JK needs to be higher. And like, we'll talk about what you have ahead of him. It's compelling conversation. This is a pretty good case. I think I would have had this higher on the list. And I can't remember what I was thinking at the time. I did have a vote that year. But like looking back on it, I don't think JK's contributions are probably quite appreciated enough. And I think there's a case to be made that maybe he could have been second among the 3 candidates that year.
And like, do you think a borderline? So again, he got to 2,000 yards in the postseason. Like a borderline 2,000-yard rusher for an undefeated Ohio State team. Couldn't that win? Is that like that? That's like a kind of a winning case, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
if the quarterback is just good, not great, and if you don't have an all-time defensive player on the other side,
yes.
If he's the guy, and now there's another part of this 2019 thing that I'll save until the end. But I think in a vacuum, this is a pretty good case. You think it maybe should be even higher than 6th. So I have Zeke in 2015 as 5th. Zeke in 2015 at the time of the Heisman, I think is 154 yards a game, and Derrick Henry at the time of the Heisman when he wins it is 160 yards a game. That's total yards from scrimmage because Zeke had a little more receiving yards than Derrick Henry. Zeke has 19 touchdowns. Derrick Henry has 23. So I think part of the point here is that Derrick Henry at the time of the Heisman has 9 games of at least 100 rushing yards. Zeke has every single game of 100 rushing yards except Michigan State. He's 11 for 12. Part of the case here is that he is right there with Derrick Henry in the year that Derrick Henry wins and Zeke finishes 8th. And again, if you like vacuum this and if you throw in like they beat Michigan State and he runs for 133 instead of 33, like this is an awesome Heisman case, isn't it?
Yeah, I think JK's is probably a little better.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
Talk that out.
It's not a bad. Well, Zeke managed to find a way to be very productive on an offense that like couldn't get out of its own way, which was impressive. But like Ohio State's offense just was better in 2019, and it felt like for a lot of that year, JK was the engine of that. So, and I don't know what JK was averaging per game going into the Heisman. Do you have that? Was it more than Zeke?
I don't have that in front of me.
I would imagine it was probably right around the same thing. I think it was just like it might be more like tenor of the season kind of thing than comparing the individuals. It was like Ohio State had one of the best offenses in college football that year in 2019, and JK was, I don't know, felt like its best player for a large stretch of that. So that's why I would put JK ahead of it.
But again, this is just one of these things where we're talking about Beanie Wells, J.K. Dobbins, Ezekiel Elliott as Ohio State running backs in a world where that used to be the defining thing of Ohio State, putting together really legitimate Heisman quality seasons and just kind of like not getting a sniff in kind of like a weird way. I almost don't quite, I can't put my finger on it, but I think you could make an argument that it feels like in a world where people are voting for people that like for guys that we don't even know who they are anymore. We've never heard of some of the guys that finished ahead of them these years, but something happened. I don't know if there's a backlash. I don't know if there's a level of unrealistic expectation. Are they trying to, it's like, well, they're not Eddie George, they're not Archie Griffin. And it's like Beanie Wells didn't even make the top 10. J.K. Dobbins was 6th and Ezekiel Elliott was 8th with the years they put together. I don't know, brother.
It's really, I'm looking through JK's game log now. Sorry. You said Zeke was 100 in every game except for Michigan State. Like that was not quite the way with JK in 2019. He was under 100 yards in 4 games. Okay. One of those games he only got 8 carries. It was the Miami, Ohio game. They blew them out. He was either like, I'm going to have fewer than 100 yards or I'm going to run all over you.
Right.
He had like 193, 177, 172, 157. And then he ran for 211 yards and 4 touchdowns against Michigan before the Heisman vote. Like we did that. We rewatched that game. Like he was awesome in that game.
Yeah. There's an eye test. He looked like a dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like, is anybody like, this is one of those like, hey, remember when Bryce Love finished 2nd in the Heisman? It's like J.K. Dobbins would take Bryce Love out in the backyard and Bryce Love would never play football again. Like, what are we doing? Okay. I have Dwayne Haskins in 2018 4th, and I initially had him lower, but he threw 50 touchdown passes. And and he wound up being in this mix where it's a 3-man race with Tua Tagovailoa and Kyler Murray. It's Tua's to lose and he loses it. And Kyler Murray with a spectacular Big 12 championship game kind of seizes it. But Dwayne is right there, and Dwayne is better statistically. Dwayne leads the nation in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And I don't know, like, you're the quarterback at Ohio State and you lead the nation in passing yards and passing touchdowns. That sounds like a guy who might win the Heisman a lot of years, right?
Yeah, that's a guy who probably should win the Heisman a lot of years. And he was a guy too who I think like elevated everyone else on that offense, right? It was probably it's just easier, I think, maybe to appreciate like a Kyler Murray because he's running around like a crazy person. And Dwayne Haskins did not do that, but like Dwayne Haskins took an offense that was struggling to throw the ball for a few years with a lot of the same personnel and then turned it into the best passing offense in the country.
So they did make the Big Ten championship game that year, which I think is a very big deal. He threw for like, didn't he throw for almost 500 in the Big Ten championship game? I think he threw.
Yeah, that was the Northwestern game, right? Yeah.
Did he throw for 499?
I think it was 499 on the nose. I think that's right. Yeah.
So like, again, it's some of these things where there are moments where it's like, oh, well, that guy didn't check that box and that's why he didn't finish higher. And then you can find situations where somebody else did check that box. And then it's like, well, then why didn't they get more credit for it? So if they beat Purdue, does Dwayne win? Like if they beat Purdue and they make the playoff, does Dwayne win the Heisman over Kyler Murray and Tua Tagovailoa?
Probably. Like Dwayne, and that was Dwayne threw the ball 73 times in that game. And like when you throw the ball that many times, your number's going to end up looking pretty good. Like he was not very good in that game. I don't think, or I shouldn't say that. He was below his own standard in that game. Is probably the right way to put it. But he still ended up throwing. He threw for 470 yards and 2 touchdowns and a pick. They just couldn't finish drives in the red zone. That was sort of like, highlighting some of the limitations, I guess, with Dwayne Haskins. It's like, he's not going to run the ball down in the red zone. And then so they go like 0 for 5, I think, in the red zone in that game. So that didn't help his case either. But his last 2 weeks, as you mentioned, like the 2 weeks prior to Heisman voting, he threw for 396 and 6 touchdowns against Michigan and 499 and 5 touchdowns against Northwestern.
Didn't finish. Got to New York. All right. So I had him 4th. 3rd, I have Chase Young in 2019. And this, again, it's like, I don't know exactly what my parameters are here. It's mostly what you did without the context of the people around you. But I'm leaving a gap for a little bit of like, oh, if that hadn't happened, if he's not suspended for 2 games, like how good does this Heisman case get? Because he was suspended immediately after the Wisconsin game where he had 4 sacks and felt like the best player in the country and had this defensive momentum where it felt like he was building on the Sue conversation from a decade earlier of like, this guy's the best player in college football. What are we doing? And then right when he reached that point, I can remember walking with Chase after that game out of the interview room down the steps and like talking about this idea. I think like having a Heisman conversation with Chase for a column. And then like whatever it was, 2 days later, he's suspended. So what happens if the suspension never happens? And like, as you said already, he led the nation in sacks while missing 2 regular season games.
Yeah. And he missed games against Maryland and Rutgers. Like I think he would have just had like 6 more sacks, at least like 6 more sacks and probably like, I don't know, 7 to 10 more tackles for loss to add to the ledger. Cause he had that crazy game against Wisconsin, missed 2 games, and then came back and I think he had 3 sacks against Penn State, like immediately upon returning from the suspension. So I think it cost him tremendously. Like and it's a very similar conversation to when we just had about Marv, right? It's not like no one's looking back at the Maryland Rutgers games thinking like, oh my God, can you believe what Chase Young did? But when you look at the final tally, I don't know, 23 sacks looks a whole lot better than 16 and a half, right?
And I do think we were still in an era in 2019 where there were some voters who would not vote for a guy who had an NCAA suspension in the middle of the season.
For sure. Yeah.
So that affected it too. So I think that's like, we're having a defensive conversation on this show. This is a really strong defensive case in a lot of other ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Number 2 on my list is CJ Stroud in 2021. And this is just stats through the roof, like unbelievable. And coming off, I think we already talked about it, coming off the Michigan State game where he threw 6 touchdown passes in the first half. Is that right? Right? 6 drives, 6 touchdown passes in the first half.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
He was a minus 200 favorite going into the Michigan game. And it's a spectacular year. And I just think it wins a lot of years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah, he had the couple. Honestly, it was only like one hiccup early. Like the Tulsa game, he was not very good, right? So that was a missed opportunity to probably have even better stats than he had. Because even like the Oregon game, his stats were good, but they lost that game. They lost twice. So I don't know. I guess it's hard for some people to vote for a quarterback who's lost twice for some reason. But the cumulative case was about as good as we've seen. Like his end of season, his last. This is counting the Rose Bowl, which I know it doesn't count for
500 plus. Yeah,
yeah, but like the last 4 games of the year: 361, 5 touchdowns, no picks; 432, 6 touchdowns, no picks; 394, 2 touchdowns, no picks; and then 573, 6 touchdowns, 1 pick in the Rose Bowl. Like he was just a machine.
And finished behind Kenny Pickett.
Yeah,
he's no. You know what they always say about CJ Stroud? He's no Kenny Pickett.
That's right. That's right.
This number 1 is the only case on this list with no caveats, with the case itself, because it's all context. This is a winning Heisman Trophy season. It's Justin Fields in 2019. And the only 2 things that happened here were he had 2 other legitimate Heisman Trophy candidates on his own team, and Chase Young, who finished 4th, and J.K. Dobbins, who finished 6th. Mm-hmm. Justin finished 3rd this year. And in the same year, you had what I think arguably is the greatest Heisman season of all time.
Yes.
With Joe Burrow at LSU. And so if you cut it, Justin doesn't have to do anything else. There's not a Chase Young suspension in here. There's not a you didn't beat Michigan in here. There's not the Purdue loss for Dwayne Haskins and that's held against you in here. There's nothing that's held against Justin with his case because they're undefeated and he's awesome. And he gets hurt at Penn State and he's limping around against Michigan and he's a hero and he is a thrower and a runner and a leader and talented and tough. And he is everything. He's just splitting the vote with two teammates. And he happens to be in a year where Joe Burrow takes the sport by storm. I think you could make, and so the thing that happens here is he finishes third. He's a better candidate than Jalen Hurts. That he finished behind Jalen Hurts is a little nuts. Joe Burrow got 2,608 points. He got 841 first place votes. Chase Young had the second most first place votes with 20. Burrow is so obvious here, but total number of points, Burrow 2,608, Jalen Hurts 762, Justin Fields 747, Chase Young 643, J.K. Dobbins is 6 with 114. If Justin's not splitting it with his own teammates, he gets the 15 points to finish ahead of Hurts. And if you just cut Burrow off, I think Fields wins. So
yeah.
So and it's just like it was the bad luck of having a great year where somebody had the greatest year. But I don't think there was anything that Justin did himself that prevented him from winning.
I don't think so either. Is Justin Fields coming out of the medical tent with an offensive lineman brace on his knee, evading pressure, and then throwing a touchdown in Michigan Stadium the best Heisman moment Ohio State has had since Troy Smith won?
Man, you make me cry. That was so emotional. Yeah, right. I mean, like there's the Braxton Juke move at the goal line against Penn State. Which is like a real thing. Because like 85 yards through the heart of the South is not a Heisman moment because it's not when you can vote for the Heisman. I'm looking at all these other guys. Probably, right? I mean, it's everything you want. Joe Burrow ruined it for him. It's everything you want. It really is everything you want. And I do think even with the context of having two other teammates who are candidates, I think if Joe Burrow doesn't exist and now you're having a discussion about, well, who are we going to vote for? Do you want to vote for, like, should we give the Heisman to Oklahoma or to Ohio State? Right? Like people didn't have to have that conversation because it was all about, well, who you're voting for second or third because everybody voted for Joe Burrow because it was so obvious. If you take Burrow out, I think Fields beats Hurts because it's like, all right, are we doing, is Jalen Hurts even, I mean, they just won with Kyler and Baker and Jalen Hurts isn't as good as them, but like Ohio State's awesome. Oklahoma's not as good. Now, Oklahoma makes the playoff also in 2019, but nobody thinks they're as good as Ohio State. They get their doors blown off by LSU. And Ohio State's right there with Clemson. So I think, like, because the context changes, because once you're not voting for first, you're voting for second. You can do all kinds of goofy things. CJ Stroud didn't beat Michigan. Chase Young got suspended. Dwayne Haskins had the loss against Purdue that was probably held against him. Zeke had the Michigan State game, right? JK probably had the next strongest, purest case on its own. But like this is of the top five, Justin has the only case that is free and clear on its own merits. And it is a Heisman worthy season.
Yeah, it is. I guess one thing I would point out is like there's probably a little bit of what we talked about with Braxton. Like Justin had a handful of games that season where he threw for fewer than 200 yards. The Penn State game was like kind of clunky offensively, and then he got hurt. And it wasn't like in those games where he did throw for fewer than 200 yards, like he didn't run for like 100 yards to make up for it. So like there was a little bit of up and down in terms of passing production. End of the year, it looked awesome. 3,000 yards, 41 touchdowns, 3 picks, but there were a couple like 199 against Indiana, 194 against Northwestern, 167 against Wisconsin. He was 12 of 22 in that game. And then 188 against Penn State in that game.
So our top, so in general, is your biggest thing you'd have JK higher than 6th on this list? Because again, I made this list and I said you can disagree.
I would have JK probably I would have JK definitely ahead of Zeke. So move him up to 5th, I guess. And like Dwayne in 2018 is pretty good. The loss I think is makes you correct to have him 4th, but like from a pure number standpoint, it's hard to look at what he did that year. It's like, oh yeah, that's the 4th best. But I think you're right. Yeah.
But like part of the point is like there are like 5 or 6 like super legit candidates for a program that has not won a Heisman Trophy in 17 years, which is sort of again part of what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So again, my final list: Justin Fields in 2019, CJ Stroud in 2021, Chase Young in 2019, Dwayne Haskins in 2018, Ezekiel Elliott in 2015, J.K. Dobbins in 2019, Marvin Harrison Jr. in 2023, Braxton Miller in 2012, CJ Stroud in 2022, and Beanie Wells in 2007. The best of Caleb Downs. Let's say he is clearly the best safety in the country. He is the heartbeat of an Ohio State defense that is at least in the argument as the best defense in the country. It is the driving force of an incredibly successful Ohio State season. They're in let's say they win the Big Ten and they're the 1 or 2 seed in the playoff.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much if you said, hey, Ohio State defense is really good, who's their best player? Most people would say Caleb Downs. And he has enough offensive / return game sprinkle to have the required highlights to have at least a little bit of the magic conversation. Where do we slot that Heisman candidacy in on this Ohio State list?
I would probably put it like in so I would have JK 5th. I would put it like in the 4, 5, 6 range, like around like the Dwayne 2018 season and the JK 2019 season. I don't like maybe 5th.
Ohio State must beat Michigan for Caleb Downs to win the Heisman. Mm-hmm. True fact.
Yeah, I think so.
So the one thing I would say is like I think that sounds about right. Like statistically, if he can get through, so you're saying he's like 4, 5, 6, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
CJ is 2nd in 21, didn't beat Michigan. Chase Young is 3rd in 2019, got suspended. Haskins is 4th in 18, had the Purdue loss. Zeke had the Michigan State game. I think taking like don't get suspended and Ohio State beats Michigan, I think if we're including that at all, I think there's a chance he could. I laid out the maximum case for him. I think his maximum case maybe could be 2nd behind Justin. Because like CJ's case in 21 is so good, but they lost to Michigan.
They lost, yeah.
So if Ohio State beats Michigan, now Ohio State...
They lost twice.
Right.
Yeah.
They lost 2. So we think there's a path. There's a path. And if not, Julian Stan will win it in 26, and we'll just run this back. Okay. Worthwhile? I like that. That was fun. I hope the derail didn't derail in people's enjoyment of the show. But if somebody from the outside would be like, oh, you didn't win a Heisman in 17 years. But then like when you lay this stuff out, it is kind of crazy, isn't it?
It's why it's insane. Yeah. I don't as someone who covers Ohio State for a living, it was still a little jarring to me to like have it laid out this way.
Yeah. So, okay. We've got more stuff coming. We would invite you guys to watch and listen to Kings of the North. We did some takes about the sport on the show that we put up on Tuesday for KOTN, including talking about Aaron Dunston leaving for Michigan and what that means for Michigan and Ohio State and how that should be viewed by everybody. And we have more great shows coming your way. Again, if you want to be a tech subscriber and get Ohio State information from Bill, from me, from Berm, from Austin, that is 614-662-4509. As always, thanks to our great producer, Mike Yorostowski, for making us look good and sound good. He's Bill Landis. I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was Kings of Columbus.